Sorry, I had to finish up a message before I could come out here. Thank you all very much. If there's an oxymoron in American life, it is humble anchorman. We simply don't exist. But I must tell you, I go to a lot of conferences across the country on a lot of different issues. And this has really been a very enriching day for me and very rewarding in so many ways. All of these speakers have had original ideas that have challenged us all, and I hope I will be worthy of your attention. My other big concern is that out there in this audience, at this moment, someone is tweeting, Brokaw speaking at Portland TED conference, hashtag old dude. I can live with that. What really worries me is that someone's tweeting, Brokaw speaking at TED conference in Portland, hashtag old dick, after hearing this morning. I don't want to go there. First of all, I think I have to explain my wardrobe. Most of you see me on television, coat and tie, nice suit, the whole thing. My granddaughters are here. When they first came of age, that's how they saw me. So forevermore, they don't call me granddad, they call me Tom, because they've seen me on television all these years. But this is how they really see me. And I was thinking about this wardrobe and my choices recently when I heard Jerry Seinfeld say, men choose their wardrobe to reflect the styles of the best year in their life. Now, my wardrobe really is a composite because I haven't had any bad years in my life. Khakis, college, 1958 to 1962. Running shoes, a game changer. There is in the NBC archives a suit, a picture of me in a very serious suit on the floor of a convention, coat and tie, suit, headset on, interviewing a key delegate. Pan down, I'm wearing an early pair of Nike running shoes, and did that around the world. Patagonia jacket liberated us from trench coats and from safari jackets around the world. You could crumple them up, put them in your suit bag, go to Somalia, go to Iraq, go to a war zone somewhere, and be not only in fashion, but be entirely comfortable as well. And then finally, an Italian cotton shirt, very expensive, left over from the days when NBC gave me a really generous wardrobe allowance. And a baseball cap from my days in junior high. This is who I am, and this is how I appear before you today. Someone who, at this stage in his life, has won the American lottery, in every sense of the word. Where I grew up, the kinds of parents that I had, truly working class, meeting the love of my life when I was 15 years old, although it took her 7 years to figure that out. The extraordinary children that we have and their offspring, two of whom are here with us today. The opportunities that I've had professionally as well, not just at NBC News, but the opportunity to write a book called The Greatest Generation, which really launched me in a whole other form of journalism, writing books about the American way and the American story. And now I'm at a stage in my life when I'm invited to come to conferences like this and be the final speaker. And so the pressure is really on me to have something to say. And I have been thinking a lot about my own life, not just the good fortune that I have, but also about where we are in the American dream, in the long and extraordinary travel and trip that this country has made from its earliest days. The 20th century was known as the American century, with good reason. But how will the 21st century be known? Well, at the moment, if you were to take the measure of the 21st century and our place in it, you'd be pretty ambivalent about the conclusions that you might come to. I've been doing this for a half century now, an American political reporter, in every presidential election, really, since 1964 and 68, and from then on. I've watched the rise and fall of our political culture. I was a White House correspondent during Watergate, the greatest constitutional crisis in America. And when the American people and the Supreme Court understood what Richard Nixon had done, the rule of law prevailed, and we went on. So we have a remarkable system that is very resilient, but it's being tested at the moment. And it's being tested, I believe, by small ideas that divide us. So I've been thinking about my lifetime and the big ideas that have united us. And I'd like you to join me, if you will, in a time travel today. The test is, what if? First big idea in my lifetime. I was born in 1940. I'm an old dude. Before World War II started. A lot of people don't realize that in 1939, America was the 16th military power in the world. Dwight Eisenhower in 1938 was still a lieutenant colonel who had never heard a shot fired in anger. But the free world was at stake. Hitler had already invaded Poland at that point. Not too long after that, he was marching on the lowlands and moving into Scandinavia, engaging the Russians and taking over France. And we were going to have to get involved in the war, but there was an enormous sense of isolationism here at home. And then the Japanese attacked us in Pearl Harbor. And we had to go to war in the Pacific and also in the Atlantic against the German Nazi Empire, the greatest war in the history of mankind. The world that we know today was at stake in that war. Before it was over 50 million people had perished. It was fought on 6 of the 7 continents. And all the skies and all the seas, on the seas and beneath the seas as well. And it did come to an end in a reasonably short period of time. But if it hadn't been for that big idea of how we got ready for that war, by shutting down all civilian vehicle production in America and turning out new kinds of trucks and weapons. The airplane plants in America didn't turn out civilian aircraft anymore. They went to fighter aircraft and long-range bombers. In the state of Oregon, Mark Hatfield, a deeply religious Christian, was a pacifist until the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor. And he enlisted the next day, and he ran a landing craft onto the beaches of Iwo Jima in 1944. That's what happened to America. It was a big idea that occurred all at once. And before the war was over, when we were in deep debt in America trying to finance this war, because remember, the greatest generation was formed first by the Great Depression. They experienced every day of their lives deprivation and sacrifice, and not a lot of optimism that the next day would be any better. And just as that was coming to an end, they were asked to go thousands of miles across the Pacific and thousands of miles across the Pacific and fight the greatest military machines that had ever been assembled, while at home, farmers grew more food so the troops would have what they needed. Wives went to work in factories and drove big trucks. I lived on an army base when I was 3 years old, and my first image of women were in bandanas, bib overalls, carrying lunch boxes, and driving 8x8 trucks through the ordnance depot where we worked. That was a big idea. And in 1944, when we knew that the war would come to an end at some point, Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, created the GI Bill. So when these veterans would come home, they could go to college or a technology school, and they could be prepared for the post-war economy. And no piece of legislation in the 20th century so transformed America economically and in terms of the promise of its future as the GI Bill. They came home, they lived in crowded student housing, they became lawyers and engineers and scientists and educators and physicians and public servants. That was an enormously big idea. So what if we had not had the GI Bill? That's something that I think about every day. And when the war ended, African Americans came home as well. They'd served heroically and nobly in every theater of war, almost always in segregated outfits. Some of them later were awarded the Medal of Honor for their unalloyed heroism, especially in Italy and Europe. And yet they returned to a country in which they were treated not just as second-class citizens, but too often as third-class citizens. For those of you who have not yet seen it, I highly recommend the film 42, the story of Jackie Robinson, the greatest hero of my youth, because my parents said to me, the Dodgers have signed a Negro to be the first of his race to play in the major leagues, and we're going to be for the Dodgers. And I lived every day and every night by the exploits of the Dodgers, and especially Jackie Robinson. It was 1948 when they signed him. He was already 28 years old. He'd been a three-sport letterman at UCLA, and he'd been a commissioned officer in the war, and you cannot believe the trials that he went through in that first year, even from his own teammates. This is 1948. Tuskegee Airmen came back, one of the most highly decorated fighter squadrons in the European theater, an all-black outfit, flying P-51s. And after the war, they went into an officers' club in Georgia, and they were thrown out because no Negroes were allowed. But white officers from the South were entertaining in that same officers' club white German officers of war who had been imprisoned nearby. They were their guest. They'd been our enemy 24 hours earlier. Now they were the guests in the officers' club, and the Tuskegee Airmen, when they sat in that club, were court-martialed. And it took several years for that to be reversed. So these African Americans came home, and they were determined to make their place. The next big idea in America. What if Dr. Martin Luther King had not come along and led this country in an extraordinary crusade based on two fundamental principles: a trust in the rule of law, that all men and women in America are created equal and have equal rights to vote, to go to school where they want to purchase what they wanted to in whatever store they decide to enter, and to sleep wherever they decided to. And the other fundamental principle was to advance that cause nonviolently. People often ask me about the most memorable parts of my career, and I say easy. I was in the South in the 1960s. And to be in a place like Americus, Georgia, or Haneyville, Alabama, or any of the other hellish places where young civil rights workers were confronted by attack dogs and baton-swinging highway patrolmen or city policemen or rednecks who emerged out of the woods. They would go down into a fetal position, take the blows, get up and walk again. And it transformed us. We are who we are today in large part because of the Civil Rights Act. It's still an unresolved journey, even with the election of an African-American president. Race is still one of the great tension points in America, but we are making constant progress. That was a big idea. John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960, and of course we all know that he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." But then he said, when he came into office, we're going to go to the moon within 10 years. We're going to slip the bonds of Earth and place a man on the lunar surface. What if John F. Kennedy had not had that big idea? That big idea unleashed science and technology and engineering and refired the American spirit of advancing the frontiers of who we are. That was a very, very big idea. The 1960s were uneven in big ideas, but there were two great big ideas that came out of the 1960s. Guido Rohr, who preceded me, obviously, is a child of one of those ideas, and that's the environmental movement. In 1968, Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin, said we should celebrate Earth Day. And what happened across America is that a new generation of Americans began to rise up through the ranks and say that we have to have the principles of conservation as an everyday and important value in our lives. Meredith and I were living in those days in Southern California. She arrived there in May. In August, late August, she looked out our window and said, "Oh my God, there's a mountain range over there," which had been completely obscured by smog for the last 6 months. Those are the conditions with which we were living. When I was a child living in the Black Hills of South Dakota, we were warned not to go into some creeks because they were so toxic from the runoff from the Home State gold mine that you couldn't go near them for fear of what would happen to you. So that movement began. It was a big idea. The other big idea that came out of the 60s, of course, is that women not only have the right, but we now have a proactive movement to get them to occupy any place in American life that they choose to. And as a result of what began in the 1960s, I honestly believe that big idea will mean that this century, the 21st century, at the end of it, will be judged in a lot of ways. But the one thing I'm sure of is that historians will look back and say, that was the century of women. That's when women began to take their place. I've just written something for Sheryl Sandberg's blog. I looked at President Obama at the end of the luncheon, celebrating his second term in the Capitol, walking into the rotunda, standing silently and reflectively before the statue of Dr. Martin Luther King that is now in Statuary Hall. When I was a young man coming of age and race was a hugely important part of my professional calling, I could not have imagined first that there would be a statue of Dr. King in Statuary Hall, or that an African-American president, shortly after the turn of the century, would have been elected to his second term as president. So I tried to project what will happen at the turn of the next century. After all, women in many ways are so much more advanced now than African Americans were then. More than half the Ivy League presidents are women. The head of the original old white boy establishment, IBM, is now a woman. President Obama has just named a new head of the Secret Service, a woman. We now have 20% of the United States women, and by the way, they have their own caucus in which they get so much more done than the warring white guys. More than half the enrollees in medical school and in law school are women. Doesn't mean that they have an easy path. As the father of 3 daughters and 4 granddaughters, I know the challenges ahead of them, balancing all the parts of their lives that they want to have. But we need everybody on deck and pulling on oars, and women are going to be a critically important part of that. We know about their place in the Supreme Court. I'm not going to get into names. I don't want you to read anything of this. We're going to have a woman as president before the end of the century. I just got back from South America. A woman president of Argentina, a woman president of Brazil, the most effective woman in recent Chilean history, a woman. The most powerful woman in Europe, Angela Merkel. The head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde. The one woman that everybody celebrated around the world, uneven as her record may have been, was Margaret Thatcher, who was the most powerful and defining figure in many ways of her time. This is baked in to our history. That's a big, big idea. Richard Nixon had a lot of bad, big ideas. He had one great big idea. In 1972, he said to Henry Kissinger, I want you to go to Beijing and open a relationship with China. Now, some of you don't remember this because you're too young. But before that happened, China might as well have been one of those blank spots on the map that said, beyond here, serpents lie. We really didn't know what was going on in that country of 800 or 900 million. We didn't even know how many people they had at that point. But Nixon, a man of a conflicting reputation in terms of his brilliant ability to see the world, but the darkness that would take over his personal conduct were constantly in conflict. But he did say to Dr. Kissinger, we don't share their values, we don't share their political system. They have 2,000 years of civilization, and they will reemerge at some point in our time. And we need to have lines open that we can talk with them and that they understand who we are and we have a better understanding of who they are. And as a result, we're in a much better place today than we would have been if we had continued to treat them as we were then, as just communist China, no relationship whatsoever. That was a big idea. Ronald Reagan came to office determined to confront the Soviet Union. It was the most lethal war in the history of mankind, the Cold War. In fact, now, given the state of the foreign maps in which we have stateless enemies in the Middle East especially, and all the changes that are going on in North and South Korea and in the subcontinent. You have to remember in those days it was really a bifurcated world, East and West as we described it. The United States against the Soviet Union against the United States, both countries pointing at each other, enough firepower to eliminate life on Earth as we know it. Two extraordinarily conflicted value systems, economic systems, and political systems. And Reagan was determined to confront that. Gratefully, he had, in a way, a partner on the other side, Mikhail Gorbachev, a new generational leader in that country who understand that their system could not sustain itself, given the past practices and the challenges coming from other places in the world. So they began a dialogue, and it was tough. And the conditions were often uncertain in terms of where they were going to end up. But they found a way to resolve those differences. And Gorbachev began to dismantle the Soviet Union, although he did believe he could hang on to communism, and that was one of the few flaws that he had in the leadership. And that war came to an end without a shot being fired, without a tank rolling. I was in Berlin the night the Berlin Wall came down. That was the final punctuation mark. I had the good fortune of being the only correspondent there with live satellite abilities. My competitors, Dan and Peter, were back home. There was nobody there from the BBC or even from CNN in those days. So there I was, out there on the prow of history, able to tell the world what was going on. Now, some of you may wonder, what are you thinking at that moment? Because it was so chaotic at the Brandenburg Gate, I couldn't even hear myself think. And I really only had one thought, knowing I was going to have to ad-lib for the next 2 hours about what we were seeing behind me. My one thought was, don't screw this one up, Brokaw. It's going to be out there forever. And I'll tell you one other thing, having given the reference I did to my wardrobe earlier, I had taken a kind of beat-up Patagonia jacket with me, as I often did. And I looked down, it was pretty ratty looking at that point. And I looked around, and one of my correspondents had just come from London and bought himself a smashing new top coat. I knew that this videotape that I was about to appear on would be around forever, and I said, bet you give me your top coat. So there I am, really well dressed for that one night at least. But it did come down. And Margaret Thatcher, on the wrong side of history, said that we should never allow Germany to be united again. By then, Ronald Reagan had left office, and his successor was his vice president, George Bush, 41, who wisely said, yes, we have to have a united Germany. We knit that civilization back together again. Those were big ideas that served us extremely well. The next big idea is one that we've been talking a lot about here today. It's a big idea in which we're still in the seminal stages. We heard Steve Jobs, in probably the greatest commencement speech ever given, talk about who he was and how he had the vision and the motivation to give us the gift that he did. But there were others as well. In the late 1980s and the 1990s, there were men working in garages in New Mexico. Jeff Bezos was driving across the country with an idea that he had. And it was the beginning of what we now call Silicon Valley / the digital age. That was a huge idea. There has never been technology as transformative as that technology in the history of mankind, and we're all the beneficiaries of it. And as I say, we're still grappling with the best and wisest use of it. One of my conclusions is that we still have not had enough of a dialogue about how we use it best. We're chasing that technology, and it is driving us in a way that we need to have a greater voice in the best use of it, in my judgment. But that was a very, very big idea. It changed how we communicate with each other, have relations with each other, how we do research and commerce, how we spread, how we absolutely end conflicts in many places as well, because we can bring people virtually together if necessary. So that was a huge idea. And it's prompted me to think about what's next. And there is kind of the intersection in a generational way of that technology and the reality with which we have been living for the last 10 years. First of all, a whole new generation of young people are coming up, and their lives are intertwined with that new technology. The social relationships that we all are aware of, and the games that they play, and how they lead their not just academic lives or their business lives, or how they determine the direction in which they want to go, but how they talk to each other on a daily basis. While that is going on, other young members of that generation are going into recruiting offices and raising their hand and volunteering for military service. And they have fought the two longest wars in our country's history. And dare I say it, very few people in this room probably have any member of their family who served in uniform there, because it's less than 1% of the population. And that less than 1% has paid a terrible price, physically and emotionally. And it's not just unjust for a democratic society to allow that to go on, in which we put the entire burden of going into harm's way on just volunteers. Well, nothing is asked of the rest of us. Not a dime in taxes, no sacrifices whatsoever. We didn't even have to think about the war if we chose to. And when they began to come home, a banner at the airport was about the best that they could expect. That's beginning to change, but it's complex. And so I think we have a common obligation to think about our next big idea. What should it be? I think it should be, we ask ourselves, what if we could design a new template for public service in America? And here's my Hail Mary. We create 6 public service academies across America at land-grant schools. Oregon State's a land-grant school. Berkeley's actually a land-grant school. Cornell, Oklahoma State, there are a lot of great land-grant schools. Why land-grant schools? Because they not only teach the humanities and social sciences, but they also teach the hard sciences of engineering and agriculture, and many of them have first-rate medical schools as well. Here's the kicker. Here's what I would do with a new form of public service. I'd make it public-private. I think you could have, for example, Johnson & Johnson fellows in medicine. Everything from advanced degrees in infectious disease to nurse practitioners to medical technologists. You could have the Caterpillar fellow in construction. Everything from operating engineers to people who absolutely know how to design the best water systems in the world, or how to construct a new road in a hostile part of the world. The opportunities are unlimited. You could have the Nike fellow spread out around the world in developing education programs that have to do with physical fitness and competitive sports. But I wouldn't assign them just internationally as a diplomatic special forces. That's what I'm calling them. I'd have them working domestically as well. Here's why. When Katrina happened, I was floating around the Fourth Ward in New Orleans with the most effective rescue crew at the time. It was the 82nd Airborne, and a young major and I were together on a boat for 2 days running, and they were getting more done than anybody else. And I said, aren't you supposed to be going to Afghanistan? He said, well, sir, it set back my training 2 weeks. When Joplin, Missouri happened, when they had a terrible tornado rip through there, what happened? The Missouri National Guard got called out. Many of those units had already been on 2 and 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. When we had Hurricane Sandy sweep across the East Coast, first response, get the National Guard in there. We've got to complement that first response with highly trained people who can learn a new skill set at the same time that they feel a commitment to serving their country. So I think that this is an unparalleled opportunity for us to address a lot of the issues that bedevil us today. We are too divided up. We're too pitched one against the other. Red state, blue state, Tea Party, older generation versus younger generation. The so-called millennial generation is extraordinarily suspicious of the institutions in American life that most of us have taken for granted. When you talk to them about why they're moving back home after they graduate from college, they'll say, I've got a $25,000 debt, there are no jobs out there, and by the way, my father worked for one corporation for 30 years and they fired him last week. Why do I want to go to work for a big American corporation? So they're looking for another way to invest their lives in their own welfare, but also in the common welfare of this country. And what I say to young people who spend so much of their time in that digital universe, there is another way for you to connect to each other in a more meaningful fashion. And I try to remind them that it's best to have a world in which you have real connectivity before the two worlds, between the analog world and the digital world. And one of the ways I remind them of that is I say, there is no text message in the world that will ever replace someone that you deeply care about whispering in your ear, I love you. You can't hold hands with an iPad in a movie. I don't want to ever hear a song that has as its lyrics, a tweet is just a tweet as time goes by. I just don't want to hear that. So I think it's up to us, this generation, to have a big, bold idea that will help define our time and our place in the 21st century. Because I promise you, 100 years from now, historians will look back and they'll make a judgment, not just about the NRA, or about President Obama, about a red state or a blue state. We're all on the dock. And these big ideas that have worked so well for us, that I have just described for you in the last 20 minutes, were really the product of people from the ground up. They made them happen. Our senior statesmen and other visionaries gave them the dream, but the dream was executed by the rank and file of America. When I heard Ben talking today about immigrants coming here, we still are an immigrant nation. And they do come here in pursuit of the American dream. And they do put their shoulder to the wheel. And we'll always be better for that if we have a keen understanding of it. Let me finally just leave you with one story that has been, for me, the iconic story of the last 6 months. It has nothing to do with sequestration. It has nothing to do with background checks or the terrible tragedies that we've experienced in Newtown and also in Boston recently. The iconic photograph for me of the last 6 months occurred in December in the nation's capital, in the Rotunda, where Danny Inouye, the senator from Hawaii, lay in state in a flag draped casket. And from some distance away, a photographer took a picture of his longtime friend Bob Dole standing over the casket, saluting it. I know the history of these two young men. They both went to war from their respective states, Hawaii and Kansas. Danny was a Japanese-American citizen whose family had been in Hawaii since 1895. But when he heard that his cousins and aunts and uncles on the mainland were being shipped off to internment camps, he volunteered for duty in the 442nd, an all-Japanese American outfit. Again, race played a part in all that. As he stood on the dock in Honolulu, his father said to him, "This country has been very good to your family. Now you may have to die for this country. But if you do, it will be a great honor for your family." And with those words, he went off to war and earned the Medal of Honor and lost an arm in Italy in extraordinarily heroic action. Didn't get the Medal of Honor until later because, again, race played a part in denying him. Within the same 20-hour period, Bob Dole, poor kid from northern Kansas, his family rented out the upper floors of their house. They lived in the basement. He went off to the University of Kansas on a three-sport athlete. You see pictures of him in those days. He was an Adonis, beautifully, beautifully developed. He would have been a Just Do It poster for Nike, I can promise you. He volunteered for the 10th Mountain Division. And the day after Roosevelt died, his entire right side was shot up, leading an assault on a heavily fortified German position. They didn't think he would make it down the mountain. Certainly didn't think he'd walk again. But he made it all the way back to Michigan to a little VA hospital that had been set up there, and he was in a small ward with this tiny man from Hawaii who had lost an arm. and this other man from Detroit who came from a powerfully connected family of great wealth, could have avoided combat, but he'd been gravely wounded on D-Day. And the three of them would lie awake at night and talk about what they're going to do with their lives, having been through all that they'd been through. And they decided that public service would always be a part of their lives. And they had a reunion in the United States Senate when each was elected from his home state. Danny Inouye, Democrat from Hawaii, Phil Hart, Democrat from Michigan, who died much too early from cancer, and when he did, both sides voted to name the most prestigious office building on the Senate side after Phil Hart. And of course, Bob Dole of Kansas, a Republican, presidential candidate of his party, Republican leader of the Senate. But Danny Inouye and Bob Dole were joined, physically almost, but certainly they were joined emotionally by their experiences during the war and their commitment to their country and their determination to move it forward without getting up in the morning and saying to one another, I can't talk to you, you're from a red state or a blue state. Or this is an issue that I can't talk to you about because other members of my party say I would be a traitor to our cause. They constantly talked. And they advanced the country together. And as Bob Dole stood there, saluting his friend Danny Inouye, I also knew that he had been wheeled into the rotunda in a wheelchair, but turned to his handlers and said, I don't want Danny's last vision of me to be in a wheelchair. I want to salute him by standing at his side. I think that's a wonderful metaphor for us to all carry from this remarkable day, that we salute each other, we stand at each other's side, and we go into the future together. Thank you all very much. Thank you.